Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
Hey, I'd like to wish you a Merry Christmas. And a funny thing is, I understand that that's actually an Americanism. That in many parts of the English-speaking world, the normal phrase is Happy Christmas. I'd like to wish you a Happy Christmas, that is. Which also I suspect is more traditional, because it's at the end of the poem, and I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, a Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. From the poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." So that, I think, even in America had been the normal phrase. And there's something I think very interesting about that. Because the word happy in English is one of the possible translations of the Koine Greek, and also I think Attic Greek, of word makarios. Makarios also is probably more commonly, especially in modern English, translated as blessed. It's the word that you see in the Beatitudes. Like when Christ says, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers. Well, the word there is makarios. And I've seen it. You can find some Bibles where that's translated as happy are the peacemakers, happy are the meek, happy are the poor. And so there's a very interesting element there, that translation of both. And it's, as I understand it, the original Greek contains both ideas. It's sort of more commonly translated as blessed because that sort of captures more of, it's more of the meaning, but it means both, because the thing is, when you are blessed, you are happy. Because they're both, they both stem from that idea of being given something. So that when God fills you up, you are happy. That is the condition of your happiness. That is how happiness in fact works, in the same sense that, like, when you have air filling your lungs, that's where you get oxygen from. It's just inherent in the nature of what we are, is we need to be filled by God. And also inherent in the nature of God is that God fills us. You can see it, it comes from, natural philosophy. I'm sorry, natural theology, which is, some of the early parts in the Summa Theologia. Summa Theologica, rather. The part that can be known by reason. So take any of the arguments. My favorite is the argument from contingency. I'm assuming everyone's familiar with that, but the argument from contingency where a thing is contingent if it doesn't have to be. And so we're all contingent, obviously. We didn't have to be. It was possible for us to not exist. And so we exist because something made us. Especially all composite beings are contingent because our pieces didn't have to be together. And so, so essentially, work that backwards. There has to be something at the beginning of this chain which is not contingent. Otherwise, it would never have happened. That thing is God. And now that's in the natural philosophy sense. We don't, at that moment, at that step in the argument, we don't know anything other than it is not contingent. That's why the Summa Theologica has 5 volumes to it. He explores further, a great deal more, comes out of this. Because the thing is, if a thing's not contingent, it has to be simple. It can't have parts, because if it had parts, then something had to put them together. They have to be together for some reason. So they can't have, a non-contingent thing can't have parts. It must be simple. If it is simple, if it doesn't have parts, it must be unchanging, because to change is for some part of you to come into existence or some part of you to go out of existence. And, the trivial example being growing, where new parts of you are coming into existence as you grow taller or wider, whatever it is. Or, becoming bald, where your hair falls out. There's all change implies, something coming into existence, something passing out of existence. Well, none of that works for something simple, so God is in that sense unchanging. And, happy and so on. So all these things we know about the uncontingent source of all that is, which is contingent, which is to say everything we can find. Everything in time is contingent, for example. And so, and by the way, I'm not making this argument to try to convince anyone of anything. This is, I'm just recounting it very, very briefly, sort of to help people remember. But one of the big things it tells us is that since God is unchanging and God is simple, God is also happy because God lacks nothing. God has the fullness of himself since he's simple, and therefore simple in that metaphysical sense, and So when you put all that together, it means that creation can't add anything to God. God can't be added to because he doesn't have parts. He is simple. So God plus creation is no greater than God on his own. And so creation by contrast, being made of contingent things, is made of parts. We are all composite beings. Made of subatomic particles, but also very interestingly, made of cells that all work together and are alive, sort of in their own right, and moreover, largely, numerically speaking, largely made, in fact, of bacteria. It's one of the more recent discoveries in biology that numerically speaking, we are more bacteria than we are our own cells. The bacteria are much smaller than most of our cells, however. So in terms of actual mass, we're mostly ourselves. The bacteria just outnumber ourselves. But we work very symbiotically. We need bacteria in a variety of ways. Really captured, in fact, by the enteromammary pathway, where women, it's something I think all mammals have, where they actually find the good bacteria in their intestines, essentially cage them up, transport them through their blood into their mammary glands, and put them into their milk for their offspring, because having the right good bacteria is so important. They affect all sorts of things. All sorts of health issues are turning out to be, issues with our symbiotic bacteria, in fact. Also calling into question some of our widespread use of casual use of antibiotics. On the flip side, most of these are so well entrenched that the antibiotics frequently aren't that bad to them, and where we have real problems. So I'm not saying antibiotics are bad, just that it's calling into question, particulars of the cost benefit analysis. Maybe moving a little bit, where things are, and also pushing to the importance of things like probiotics restoring gut health and so on afterwards. So anyway, I'm sorry, that's quite a digression. But it's still very interesting that we are very composite, made up not only of many of our own cells, which themselves have differentiated quite a lot, muscle cells and nerve cells, incredibly distinct from each other. But moreover, we're made up in no small part of other life forms, and yet all of us together form a single person, coherent person. Um, Pardon me. So that's, and I don't want to go off into, there are all sorts of interesting topics that come about, in the subject of, the reality of composite entities. Because there are people who take a sort of hyper-reductionist view, where they claim that essentially, well, none of that actually, the person isn't real. It's only a collection of cells, or it's only a collection of subatomic particles. And nothing, no arrangement of them means anything. That's just what they are, and so on. And it's sort of obvious nonsense. The entire world we live in is all composite entities, and these things are in fact real. They're just people who have trouble dealing with reality, and so they like to pretend that these things aren't real. It makes it easy to understand if there's nothing there to understand. I'm not sure why that's so emotionally satisfying, but well, there you go. Anyway, so getting off of that topic, getting back to it, the relationship of God to us, since we can't give anything to God, since we can't change God, to give him something would be to add to him in some fashion. We can't do that. And all within religious context, we do talk about, giving your life to God, giving your time, talent, and treasure to God, and so on. It's all metaphorical. It's giving it, it is using it according to God's purpose. Using your life according to God's purpose for your life is what we really mean by giving your life to God. You can't actually add anything to God. God doesn't lack anything, so you can't give it to him in a literal sense. But having said that, because we can't give anything to God, the only possible reason God can have created us is for our sake. And this speaks to the boundless generosity of God, that God creates us not for anything, not that we have any value to him, but purely so that he can give more to us. So he calls us into being out of nothing, just so he can give to us. It's an amazing relationship, and that's hence why the love of God is in Greek. I don't know if any of you have read C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves. I do really recommend the book. Excellent book. And he talks about the four words, and the chief of them, or the most important of them, is agape, which is reserved for the divine love. there's a love between lovers like Eros. There's a love between friends, Philos. There's Storge, the love, familial love, love of the familiar. And then there's agape, which is the love of God, which is, I don't mean loving God, but I mean the way in which God loves. Because God loves in a purely generous spirit. Bishop Barron likes to describe it as willing the good of the other as other. But in any event, God's love is a purely generous love. It is given to someone purely because they are capable of receiving. And so, from God's perspective, He had to first create us that we could be capable of receiving. Um, and there's a whole other interesting topic I won't get into about how He then even gives it to us to become part of His gift. Because when you give somebody, like if you see a homeless person asking for food and you give them food, you are being God's feeding of that person. You are being incorporated into God's act of giving this person food. And so it's, when for any parent, when you feed your child, you're being God's feeding of your child. For anybody who talks to another person, you are being, there are things that the being in community, if you're communicating any knowledge, communicating knowledge especially, you are being God's gift of knowledge to a person when you communicate knowledge. So we are actually incorporated into God's loving action, which itself is kind of an amazing thing. And so, bring it back, to the nature of Christmas, which is where God enters in a sinful world which is broken down. That God enters the world in order to restore it, not because we deserve it, but simply because we can receive that sort of gift, because we can be restored. God comes and gives us salvation. So it's an amazing act of generosity, and there's also that very curious, very frequently talked about, the symbolism of Christmas, wherein God appears not as a king, not in might and majesty, but as a little child, a helpless child. Chesterton, in his book, the Everlasting Man, I always think of it as the chapter title, God in the Cave. But he talks about the strangeness that the creator of the world became too small to reach the enormous heads of the cattle. So there's that enormous humility that God doesn't need to be given anything. That in God's mission to come and give, He showed up as a poor person in a completely out of the way, inconsequential, insignificant place. And then, actually worked and earned his living and so on. So, there's the entire nature of the Christmas story is that in which God does not need anything from us. God is here to give to us. Which fits in perfectly with that what we learn from natural theology. What we can know by reason, by examining, the things that, the natural things that exist and seeing, what do they tell us about themselves and therefore about their creator. So it's an endlessly fascinating subject. There's just, so much in it and so much to think about. But anyway, since I meant for this to be short and I'm kind of going on and on, I want to wrap up with, given all of that, given the nature of to be blessed is to be filled up by God, and to be given and to be happy is to be filled up by God. So to be happy is to be blessed. I just, to alter it very slightly and just sort of keeping with that. Happy Christmas.
Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
Hey, I'd like to wish you a Merry Christmas. And funny thing is, I understand that that's actually an Americanism. That in many parts of the English-speaking world, the normal phrase is Happy Christmas. I'd like to wish you a Happy Christmas, that is. Which also I suspect is more traditional, because it's at the end of the poem, and I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "A happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." from the poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." So that, I think, even in America had been the normal phrase. And there's something I think very interesting about that, because the word happy in English is one of the possible translations of the Koine Greek, and also I think Attic Greek, of word makarios. Makarios also is probably more commonly, especially in modern English, translated as blessed. It's the word that you see in the Beatitudes, like when Christ says, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers." Well, the word there is makarios, and I've seen it. You can find some Bibles where that's translated as "Happy are the peacemakers, happy are the meek, happy are the poor." And so there's a very interesting element there